All right, well, welcome everyone. I apologize for that. Welcome to the session here, Callable Pipelines for API Pagination. Just was saying there that we're going to go into some really some of the more sophisticated aspects of pipelines. So for folks that are familiar with like APIs and have done some pipelines before, maybe even worked with some automations, it's probably going to be a great session for you. If you've never worked with any of that stuff, definitely welcome to stay if you want to learn, but just want to make sure you know that we are going to go kind of deep into this stuff from a technical perspective. So if you think you'd get more benefit from another session, just wanted to let you know up front, but definitely welcome to stay and learn. So with that said, let's get started here. My name is Scott Galloway. I've been with Quickbase for close to 11 years now. I've done a number of different roles with Quickbase. I'm currently serving as a solution architect. What that means is I work with a lot of our larger customers on performance, scale, architecture, and integration. Right? And so this session here, Callable Pipelines with API Pagination, has kind of come out of some of the work that I've done with a lot of those customers where they have a need to work with different data sources and move data. And sometimes some of the native channels, right, the Quickbase channel, for instance, doesn't get as sophisticated as one might want. So this kind of leads us into doing some stuff that's a little more complex using some of the generic channels. So. All right, what are we going to talk about today? So first, we're going to talk about the problem we're solving, like why are we even talking about this? Then we're going to talk a little bit about what pagination is, what callable pipelines are, talk a little bit about Jinja, just to kind of ground people on what that is if you haven't worked with it before. Then we're going to take those three concepts, put them together to solve a use case, right? And then we're going to talk a little bit more about what to look out for, because we are going to be using the webhook channel, which is a very generic channel. We have plans to take those generic channels and make them more resilient, but today, because they are generic, there's a lot of stuff you have to consider and kind of build in to handle resiliency and failures and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about what those things are, so you guys are kind of armed and don't kind of shoot yourselves in the foot. All right. So the problem we're solving, like, what are we talking about here? So this is kind of came about when I've worked with customers who need to move or replicate large data sets, right? So now more than ever, right, systems need to share data, and people expect to get data from source systems, get that data into another system like a Quickbase, and be able to work with that data. A problem arises, or not a problem, but a challenge arises when you need to work with large data sets. When you work with large data sets, moving them between systems, there's kind of boundaries or restrictions with the different systems that you have to take into consideration. And so one of those things is managing payload size. And that's just like the amount of data that I'm moving from one place to another. So while one system might be able to handle more data than another in a given move of data, you need to be aware of what the restrictions are, what the boundaries are, to make sure that you're applying the right mechanisms for moving that data. The next piece is performance, right? When you do this, right, you're moving large data sets, you have to consider performance. Every system is different. So for instance, with Quickbase, when you're moving data into Quickbase or you're querying for data, you're actually taking away or you're leveraging some of the compute power of that application, and you're competing with the end users in the application. So you want to do it in a way where you're not impacting the end users. You want to be very thoughtful and understand what impact you're having on the applications when you're moving data in and out. And that's the same for any system. So getting into pagination, I'm sure a lot of folks know what pagination is, but just to kind of ground anybody who's not quite sure, it's just basically a sequence of pages that are connected, right, and have very similar data in them. So if you think about something like a commerce site like Amazon, for instance, if you search for an item, you could get 1,000 results, but no human can process 1,000 results just in one viewing, and the web page would look horrible. So what those sites do is they do pagination. I'm sure everybody's familiar with when you get your top 10 back and you scroll down to the bottom and you can see, oh, I can click 2 and I go to the next page and I see the next 10 items in my list. Same thing with Google, right? When you put in search terms and you search for a topic, you go to the very bottom, you have the same thing. You have pagination in place. With Quickbase, we do pagination for 2 reasons. One, to improve the user experience, so a user doesn't have to process all the data on one page, right? And then the second is we do it to optimize performance, because you might not need 1,000 records back to look at. Maybe you only need say the top 10 or the top 100. We don't want to give you extra data back and actually have to process that. So we paginate to improve the user experience and to help with performance. So in looking at this screen here, you look at the bottom of the screen. This should be very familiar for anyone who's worked with large data sets in Quickbase. This is just an example of pagination, where we're on page 3 here, and we can go to page 4 or 5, page 20, or we can go ahead and type in and go to the end, right? So that's pagination from a UI perspective. When we take a look at it from an API perspective, we're gonna use Quickbase as an example here, right? Because Quickbase supports API pagination. As should any sort of intelligent endpoint that you're working with, there should be some object and some parameters that you can work with to support pagination. The way that it's done might be a little bit different than Quickbase, but we're going to use Quickbase as the example here. So off to the left there, you see the Quickbase API. We've got some query options in there. And then off to the right, we have the response from that query, and we have a metadata object. So those are the 2 key pieces that we're going to use here in order to be able to do pagination. So if we look at the options that we can supply in the query, one of the options there is skip, and that's saying skip 600. Skip is essentially how many records from the beginning, or from the first record, do I want to skip and then start from that number of records. The second piece is top. Top is how many records do I want Quickbase to return me, right? So if you think about these 2 things, you have a list of the current skip plus top, which equals your next skip. So if I have 600 records that I've skipped, and then I have, I say, get me back the top 200, that means the next time I skip, I want to skip the first 800. And so if you look down below there, you can see kind of like 4 steps here of pagination, where I start at 0. My top is 200. That's going to return me records 1 through 200. Then the next time I go through, my current skip would be 200, and my top would be 200. That gets me back records 201 through 400, which means my next skip is 400, so on and so forth. Stop there real quick. Any questions on that? If you type them in, we have Bree Mackey, who's here on the session with me today, and she can handle any questions that come up in the chat or relay them to me.
I'm just like Vanna White here. I'll just relay them to you, but no questions so far.
Good. All right. Cool. So next step, what's a callable pipeline? This is something that I think a lot of people have seen but haven't really played with, or if they have, they haven't quite figured out, how to leverage them. It can be a little bit tricky at first, but I think once you kind of see it in action, it'll make sense. So callable pipeline is just simply a pipeline that's being called from another pipeline, right? That's all it is. People who've written scripts before, it's essentially like defining a function with some arguments. Right. So when we look at callable pipeline, in order to have a callable pipeline, we need a pipeline that triggers it. So that is the triggering, you have the triggering callable, the triggering pipeline to call the callable pipeline, right? Here's the callable pipeline. So then in any triggering pipeline, right, you can have any series or any number of steps preceding the callable or the calling of the callable pipeline, right? So in this use case, we have a records created in Quickbase that triggers this pipeline. You could have a bunch of other steps, but in this use case, the next step here is call the callable pipeline. The thing to be aware of here is there's a call definition, and that call definition between the pipeline calling the callable and the callable pipeline, they have to be an exact match. Not only the name of the callable, but also the arguments that are passed to it. If you don't have that, it won't work. Then you also have the arguments. So in the triggering pipeline, you're gonna supply argument. You're gonna supply the values for the arguments. So here in this example, we have a hard-coded value of 500, meaning return me the top 500 records. But you could also use data from any preceding step. So we could grab something from that step A in record created and use that and pass that into our callable pipeline as well. But for the purpose of this use case, top is an argument we're passing in because we're going to do a callable pipeline that calls itself and loops through a set of records. All right. Let's see. There is a question there. What is the skip based on? So the skip is it's based on any number that you want to use. So typically you would start at typically you would start at 0, and let's just say you had 1,000 records that you wanted to iterate through just to keep it simple, and you wanted to do 100 records at a time. So the first skip would be 0. The next time through you'd skip 100. The next time 200, then 300, then 400. Right, so you're essentially, the skip is your numbers in your pagination, like in the UI, and each number represents the next 100 records. All right. So what is Jinja? So not sure if folks here have played with Jinja a little bit, but it is a pretty powerful tool when working with the webhook and JSON channels. So basically what it is it's a web templating engine for the Python programming language. So anyone who's kind of familiar with Python or has used Python will probably be able to do some really sophisticated things with it. That being said, there's a very specific way that it's being used within pipelines, right? So the way that it's used within pipelines is these 3 pieces, right? You have statements, expressions, and comments. So the first here, statements. Any statement that you see is going to be bookended, a squiggly bracket with a %sign, bookended by those 2 things. And so in there, you could do things like for loops. So if you look at the first statement there, for record in records, it's just saying, here's a list of records. I want to loop through each one of them and get the value from each one of those. Next, there is an if statement. So you can say, if x equals y, or if this value equals that value, then go do a series of steps. You can set variables. So setting a variable and then using that variable later on in the scope of the payload body that you're working with in a webhook channel or a JSON channel. We'll get to some of the questions. Let's get through this slide and then we'll get to some of the questions there. All right, then we have expressions. So expressions are, you'll see those. They'll be represented by double squirrely brackets. So here, the first one, a.status, that just means step A, and there's a value in there called status, not a value, but a placeholder for status. And that simply is just going to interpret what's in status and then push in the value that's in status. So if the status field it has in progress, complete, on hold, whatever the value is, it's going to just shove that value in there. You can also do inline conditions. So a.status equals b.status. that's going to return you true or false, right? So it's not doing an if statement where it gives you a series of steps. It's just comparing two values and telling you true or false. I'll show you more examples of that later in the presentation. A.status.lower, that's just an example of, there's a number of filters you can apply to these values. So lower is not the only one. There's a number of different things that you can do with them. If you go to our help topic on working with Jinja, you'll see a whole list of filters that you can apply to your data. And the last is you can do some inline math between two values. Here we're just dividing a total by a number. And then the last piece here is comments. Probably one of the most underutilized aspects of Jinja, or Jinja in the pipelines. But I can tell you from experience, if you're going in there and you're building some complex things, if you go away for a couple of weeks and come back, you're going to look at it and say, well, what was I doing? So it's a really great way to make sure that when you come back, or if you give someone the YAML from your pipeline, they can get a really good sense of what's going on there. So stop there. Are there questions?
Yeah, we've got a couple in here. Tim wanted to know, is the call name the same as the pipeline name, or can it be anything and the definition just needs to match? So I believe it's the definition, name, and...
Definition, name, and arguments have to be an exact match. I don't know if that answers the question. They have to be an exact match. If they're not, it won't work.
Okay. The next question is from Rohit, and he asks, what is the max number of records that can be output in a single call, which I think unless you are including user type fields, it's not based on number of records.
Right.
It's
so
more
we'll
based
get
on the data.
Yeah, well, I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It's really there are limitations around both the source systems that you're reading and writing from, and then also the payload body within the webhook channel. I'll talk about that. That's one of the things that I'm going to touch on that you have to be conscious of. The webhook channel body is it can't be greater than 1 megabyte. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I do to make sure that I stay way below that, and then times where you just probably shouldn't even do it because there's no way to calculate.
Yep. And
right.
Last question is intelligent pagination limit returned by the API? If not, can it be so our applications can respond dynamically?
Yeah, no, that's great. What's that? I was going to say, that's a great question.
No, go ahead.
It can do it intelligently, and so I'm going to talk about that in one of the coming slides, but I'll just touch on it. If you tell it, return me the top 1,000, or if you don't tell it to return anything, you'll still in the metadata object, you'll get the number of records returned. Right, and it'll return you the number of records that are returned based on an algorithm. I don't know all the specifics, but an algorithm that the system deems like an acceptable or a good response time. So then from that you can take how many you would skip on the next one, right? So if it returns you 200, right, then go ahead and just use that number and keep skipping by 200. So it will do it even if you don't provide the number that you want back. All right, let's we're going to take questions at the end as well, but let's move on for the sake of time here. All right, so taking a step further on how Jinja is used in a pipeline, right? So the first is data expression. So this should be very folks should be very familiar with this, right? So this is an example of a step where it's using the Quickbase channel. Any channel really will give you, these placeholders for data, and the data expressions are actually what sit behind them. So when you're dragging and dropping those pills over in your pipelines, it's essentially just putting a data expression behind it. So in this case, it's a.import underscore quarantine underscore list. You could type that in as well as an expression, or you can drag and drop it on. Let's see, the next is variables and looping, right? So you see here, this is an example of a variable. We're setting a variable of vehicles equal to a.import quarantine list. Now this is a list, and then we're actually using a filter here, which I'll talk about in the next that next example, but I'll just touch on it here. That split lines, we just know that it's a bunch of lines of data that are being imported in, and split lines actually turns it into a list. So that vehicles, it's a list of vehicles, so that later in my request body for this webhook, I can refer to it. So you see that for loop, I'm saying for each vehicle in vehicles. So now I'm looping through and I'm building out a payload for each vehicle where I'm grabbing, the ID and the name of the vehicle right there and assigning them to, fields 54 and 8. And that will repeat for every vehicle there. The next is conditional logic and filtering. So you can use in your expressions for like if conditions, you can take two data values. So here we're taking that a.top and comparing it to the B JSON metadata num record. So basically the point here is it's just taking two values and comparing them. And then also that int is saying, treat this as an integer or treat both as an integer. Just to make sure that the data types are the same that it's comparing. If it's true, you get true back. If it's false, you get false. And then that helps you determine if you want to do a series of steps. All right. So putting this all together, we talked about 3 different things individually, right? But we want to put all these things together so that we can use Callable Pipelines to loop through and do API pagination, right, across a larger record set. All right, so the use case we're going to use is very simple. It's just kind of, what if I needed to archive 100,000 records every month, right? My app is used 24/7, meaning I don't want to impact my end users. So I want to be thoughtful about how I move data from a Quickbase app to, say, a data warehouse or another Quickbase app or whatever it is. Right? I just want to be thoughtful about it, and I want to do it in a performant way. So you can do that using the Quickbase API and Callable Pipelines, right, to really control the data volumes and the requesting, the queries, and pushing data to another system. So just before we get into, the guts of it, just a high level, like what does this solution look like from a process diagram standpoint? All right. So first, you need that triggering pipeline, right? So this isn't the callable pipeline. This is the pipeline that will call the callable pipeline. So you need that first. That needs to be triggered. That could be triggered manually. It could be scheduled, or it could be triggered by, say, a record created or updated in Quickbase, or a new document added to Dropbox, anything, really. The next is that pipeline will call the callable pipeline. When it calls the callable pipeline, in our use case, we're going to query for records to be archived. We'll be smart about it, but like how many we want for each run of this. But we're going to query for records to be archived. The next, we want to make sure that records are returned, right? If there's no records returned, then obviously we want to stop the pipeline, not go on any further. If there are records returned, we want to take those records, build the payload, and then send the data to whatever the endpoint is that we want to send it to. In this case, we're going to send it to another Quickbase app, just for the sake of demonstration. Next, after we build the payload and send the data, we want to check, are there more records that I need to go and process? Because I know there's 10,000 records, but I'm only doing 500 at a time. So are there more records? Have I gone through all 10,000 or not? If I have, then we stop the pipeline. Otherwise, this callable pipeline calls itself, right? So I've worked with some customers where I've seen them create callable pipelines that just like, they think, oh, it's going to take 20 to do it, so I just have each pipeline, callable pipeline, call the next one. This is a way to do it with just a single callable pipeline that calls itself. So because you executed your query and you got in the response that metadata object about how many records were in the total query, how many were returned, how many you skipped, you can use that data to pass back into the callable pipeline what to skip next, right? So I'll stop there. Any questions on this, or were there other questions? Will we ever have the ability to call? That is a question. The question is, will we ever have the capability to call code pages with pipelines? I can make some assumptions on what you're trying to do, right? You want to be able to execute some, a script based off of a pipeline, really. And I think the answer to that is, I know our product team is looking into ways to be able to trigger running scripts. I just don't know where they are, where it's prioritized. I'd certainly take a look in user voice, or jump over into the community Slack channel and say, @Harrison Hirsch, when are you going to give me this? Please do that. Bug him. Let's see. What else do we have here? Intelligent. I think that's the only one question there. Right, Bree? Answer the other ones?
Yeah, there is another one about if definition names local to my pipelines, or if we can call other people's callable pipelines.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's right now the scope is only you. So if you have one defined and I have one defined, they're the exact same. I can only call mine. You can only call yours. I know that there's a lot of discussion about being able to create general use pipelines and things of that nature, sharing pipelines across users. We're not there yet. I don't have a timeline for it, but again, I think it's something you probably go on the Quickbase Slack channel and ask the question. All right, so let's go ahead and break this down. We're going to go through each one of these pieces, with screenshots, and then we're going to actually do it live. So here's the solution. The first part is calling the callable pipeline. So what we're looking at here is those first two pieces in the process diagram. So the triggering pipeline, as I've said a couple of times here, it has arguments, and you need to supply those arguments for when you call the callable pipeline. So in our use case, we're going to just hard code in these values. They could come from, like I said before, you could have a number of steps that come before you're calling the callable pipeline. And you could use those data values there. But in this case, it's just going to be in step A, and we're going to manually trigger it. And so we're going to say, give us the top 500 records returned, start my skipping at 0. And then two things we haven't talked about yet. I have a max 100 and an index 0 there. I'm doing these things to make sure that I don't get an infinite loop, because I think I've alluded to this a few times. The webhooks channel is a generic channel. We don't have retries or failure logic built into it right now. So it's kind of your responsibility, right? It's almost like a use at your own risk. It's a lot of power, but with that power comes a bit of responsibility. So what I like to do is kind of assess how many loops do I think is going to take, every time this runs to get through my record set. And I double that number, and I put that as my max. I started at 0, and every time the callable pipeline is called for pagination, the index goes up by 1, and I'll show you that in a second. And one of those conditions is if the max, if the index meets the number of max tries, we fail it out. And that way we prevent ourselves from getting in an infinite loop. Because I can't tell you, as much as you think that you've written your pipeline or even scripting, to handle infinite loops, there's always some edge case that you didn't think about. So I like to put that in as a best practice right now until our generic channels get a little more resilient. And then you can see here this call definition. The call definition is identical. Lead archive, passing in top, skip, max index. The callable pipeline is the same. All right. Now the next piece in here is querying, right? We want to query for the records to be archived. So when we do that, we look here off to the left. That is that's a webhook request in pipelines, where the first part here, you see we're selecting fields 6, 7, and 8. And if you look over in the response, this response example has 2 records in it for 6, 7, and 8, and there's the data values in there. Then we look at our options in our query, right? We can see step A dot skip and step A dot top, right? Those values will get replaced with whatever values are coming in through the arguments in the callable pipeline. So if you recall, the first one was skip 0, top 500. So as long as Quickbase determines that it can process what you're asking for, those 500 records, in a sufficient amount of time, you will get 500 records back. And the last piece here is the metadata for the pagination. So every response in anything that you'd have to paginate against in Quickbase will give you a metadata object. Right? And for this use case, the 2 really important pieces, like we've touched on already, the skip and the top. So here it's it's saying we skipped 900 or 9,500, and we got the top 500. So you have, if you look down right below that, I should have called that out here. Total records is 10,000. It's going to know that I should be done because I skipped the first 9,500. It gave me back the top 500, which means I've hit my 10,000 number. So I'm done. All right. So the next step here, writing the results of the query. Right? So we need to build the payload for that. So if you look off to the left, we have an example of building a payload in a webhook channel step. Right? And then off to the right, we have the response from the query in the previous step. So this is the exact same response we were just looking at. So if we look at that response, you have this data array, right, that we pass back, this JSON data array, right, and we can reference that as a list in our for loop. So if you look right there, we have, what is that? It says b.json.data, and that's pointing to this JSON array. And the for loop is saying, well, for each record in that data array, go ahead and grab me each lead, and we're going to loop through each one of those. Then you look, what we're doing is we're populating the values for that payload with the values from the response query. So if we look at that first one there, you see in the squiggly brackets, we have lead, and then we're referencing field 6.value. Well, that's just going to go replace that, everything in the squiggly brackets with the value from the response, which is, what is that, Tybalt, right? And so if you look at, after it loops through everything, what would happen if we loop through, this response query? Well, you get a payload output, right, that we're going to send somewhere. It would look just like this. And if you notice, everything that has the squiggly brackets where we had an expression is now replaced with the values from the response. Everything that had the squiggly bracket % is no longer there because it's not really part of the payload. It's just part of the templating engine. So this is what our output would look like. So stop there. And any questions here that anyone's just burning to ask? Okay. Again, we'll take questions at the end as well. All right. Moving on to the next. Oh, yeah. I just spoke to that. So your payload, even though you have the template where you're just showing things once, it's looping through each one of those and then building out your output. Because there's only 2 records, we have a payload output that represents 2 records that can be sent to the Quickbase API to insert these records. All right. So the last piece of this is determining if we have to continue the loop. Touched on this a little bit, but the first piece here is we'll have a continue condition, right? And so in this pipeline, we have 3 conditions. The first is I'm evaluating the status, saying, did the query actually execute and return me, a 200 status, right? Meaning that it actually worked. The next is I'm going to evaluate whether or not there's more records to go get. And then the last piece is I'm actually going to evaluate where I am. How many times have I called this pipeline for this execution? Have I hit that 100 threshold? If so, it'll be false. Any one of those is false, we no longer, we don't call the pipeline again. And depending on what happens, if we don't get a status 200 code, you might want to log that or send an email to yourself, right? Again, webhook channel is generic. It doesn't have resiliency built in. So you got to handle that resiliency yourself and build in some error handling logic. All right, so the really important piece here, how do we determine if there's more records? So what we do is we add together the number of records returned and how many we skipped. And we compare that to the total records that query, total number of records that query would result in. Not taking pagination into consideration, just if I query how many records should be in the result set. So let me go back one. So if the number of records plus skip is less than the total records, we know that we have more records to go process. Otherwise, we stop. Makes sense to people? Anyone have questions? Please ask them, or hold them for then. All right, moving on. Okay, so then the next piece to this is I need to call that pipeline, the callable pipeline, if there's more records to go get. And when I do, what I want to do is add the skip plus the top from that last query response, because the skip plus the top is going to tell me exactly how many, where I was, how many I got back, and where I need to start next. Okay. So hopefully that's clear for people. Sometimes it takes a moment or two to really understand what we mean by skip and top, and but once you do it a few times, like it just becomes something like second nature. It makes sense. Right, and then the last piece here we touched on already. We're evaluating where we are in this run of the loop, and if you look there at the bottom, we're just saying set the index that we're on to index plus 1. So last time, if I passed in 1, we're adding 1 to it. Next time through is 2, so on and so forth until we hit 100. If we do hit 100, which we don't want to, that means probably in an infinite loop. And we should probably log that we hit the 100 mark, or send an email to someone to let them know. Well, your pipeline might have worked. There might be a problem with it that you didn't realize, because it's just going until it hits that threshold. All right. All right, so let's do this. Let's see it in action. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see, I was told to use the window. That's better. All right. I'm hoping you guys can see my screen here. Hoping I can get some yeses. Bree, you guys can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm just refreshing these real quick. So what I have here is I just have a very simple list of customer leads. It's just like first name, last name, email address, and then a status of closed. And then I also have over here, I have a customer leads archive application with no data in it right now. So what I want to do, these things are still refreshing. Give them one moment here. Close to me. Something like a live demo. All right, maybe let me see if I can get this open in a different place. Boom, boom. Apologies, folks. I think that the kids are home and eating all my bandwidth up. Oh. Here we go. Wonderful. I promise I have something here and it works. There we go. We got that back, so this one should be back, I would hope. No, we'll just go ahead and we will find the pipeline in here. Let's go ahead and find that. All right, I'm going to go into this guy. Hopefully that'll work this time. Okay, what to do here? Looks like it's coming up, but it's just taking a really long time. There it is. Clearly things are running slow. All right, I'm sure most folks have seen this, but if you haven't, if your pipeline's on already, you don't have to turn it on and you don't have to turn it off then back on to get a logging console. You can always go to the activity and you'll see all the history, but sometimes I like to just come in here, turn on this sync, and we can see it's waiting for a pipeline to be called. So the other thing that I need to do is I need to get this guy up, which is the triggering pipeline that will call my callable. Looks like that's going to take a moment here. So that comes up. Come on. All right. There we go. All right, so this is my Callable Pipeline trigger. And like I had shown in the examples, it's just going to be one step that calls the pipeline. Could have had 10 steps before it and used any of the data that came back from any one of those 10 steps. But just for the sake of demonstration, I'm just having a one step. Looks like it went offline. There we go. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and run it. Oh, I think it refreshed on me. We're going to have to wait for this to come back. Apologies.
It's the log of the demo.
I know. It's saying it's offline, but it did that last time and then it came back. All right, there we go. All right, so we have this pipeline's running, it's waiting right here. Here's my callable. There's my call definition, the values just like you saw in the screenshots. I'm gonna go ahead, kick that off. This one's starting up. It's running, it says it's triggered. You see here, here's my output. So this one should Should go. There it goes. It's running. Now this is gonna take not a lot of time, but a little bit of time to loop through these records. People might be asking, well, why don't I just do this with the Quickbase channel? Well, you can, but the Quickbase channel can be slow when working with large record sets. Something we're aware of, something they're going to be improving rather quickly. But remember, the point of this is not just Quickbase. This is using, you could be working with, GitHub or Salesforce or any number of other systems. So I won't make y'all go through a lot of this data, but it's running here. And if I can get to one of these steps where you see it being called again, I think it's a really good thing to take a look at. But I would guess we are starting to see some records come in here. And they should come in 500 record chunks. So if I refresh this page here, you should see there we go. So it looks like we have 500. Oh, it's all done. That's awesome. 500 of 10,000. So it should be, pipeline should be finished. Yeah. Oh, nope, wrong one. It's this guy. It says it's running, but it's probably just shutting itself down. I'm clearly having some challenges with it right now, but you can see in the leads archive, it's got 500 of 10,000. So that's it for the live demo. Let me go back. Let's talk about a few more things, and then we can open it up to questions. All right. So we're back in. So the last piece here is what should you look out for, right? I've touched on a number of these things throughout, but key things, right? So the webhook pipeline channel, it's generic. Payload sizes need to be under 1 megabyte. If it's over 1 megabyte, that pipeline's going to fail. You want to build in your own error handling, your own kind of resiliency. Different use cases are going to require different ways to handle what's going on. If you're working with other systems, the way that they send you errors is going to be different than how Quickbase does. So you need to take that into consideration. Infinite loops, you don't want to get yourself in an infinite loop. There's an easy way to mitigate that. Even if you think that it's fail-safe, I would suggest to kind of build in that max loop. And then the last piece here, we haven't talked about this. If you weren't going to be, if you weren't using the webhook pipeline payload and you're just thinking about the Quickbase API and you want to write your own scripts, or you have another system where you just want to use the Quickbase API and its metadata object and its pagination, the Quickbase API has a max payload of 10 megabytes that you can send to it. That being said, I wouldn't just say, oh, well, I can just send 10 megabytes to Quickbase at a time. Other things you need to be considerate of are, that could be triggering webhooks. It could be triggering a pipeline. It could be triggering an email notification. It could be kicking off a new subscription. There's all sorts of things that happen in the background that are going to impact the end user's performance. So when you're doing, when you're doing these upserts into Quickbase, you should really get a sense of how much impact is it having on the system, and am I doing it during a time where users are using the system? And if so, maybe you don't want to do 10 megabytes at a time. Maybe you do something smaller. But every app is different, and submitting 1,000 records in one app is going to be different processing time than another. Let's see, there's one more. All right. Oh yeah. So my transitions on this slide don't work. Apologize. So key takeaways here. So we just talked about callable pipelines, Quickbase RESTful API, and Jinja for API pagination. Right. The real problem that we're solving with this is being able to move large data sets between different data sources. When you're moving in or replicating your data sets, you You want to be, thoughtful about, how much data. Like I said at the beginning, every system has different restrictions, different boundaries. So you want to be thoughtful about that. You want to consider the payload sizes and the query responses. Again, performance is, you want to make sure that, you're not impacting end users. Quickbase is not the only system that has users in it. Other systems have shared user bases. You could be impacting those end users. You want to be thoughtful about that. Any intelligent endpoint these days should have something similar or akin to the Quickbase metadata object. So just be aware of that. I've worked with a number of customers. I think like GitHub, ServiceNow, just to name a few, where they have the mechanisms available for you. And if I haven't reiterated it enough already, pipelines, webhook channel is a generic channel. It's kind of your responsibility to do the air handling and build the resiliency into it until further notice. We're definitely working on that, but just be mindful of that for the time being. So with that, take any other questions. It looks like Rohit had a few. I think 10 megabyte limit to get and post data. That's a great question. I was just looking at it or thinking about it and looked into it from a post. The response, the limit, I know on the response, on the queries, it won't just be the size. It's also because you could be returning summary fields and formula fields, things that take longer to process. So on the querying side, getting data back, it's more than just payload size. But would it max out at 10 megabytes if, say, you were able to process, 15 megabytes in, sub-second? I don't know. It seems crazy, but it's certainly something I can find out. And I've talked to Rohit quite a bit, so I'll find out and I'll let you know, Rohit, and then maybe we can respond back to everyone in this session and let them know. See, there's another one. Can you divide your num record skip to determine the number of lines you're going to make a call and then use that in your logic? So it's interesting. I did that originally, and when I went through my we do drive runs obviously for these sessions. One of the guys on my team, I think it was Ryan Flederer, who folks probably know, called out that there are situations where you could get yourself in trouble. So you want to use the how many it returned in that particular call, because even if I say I want 1,000, or I want 500 records back, if Quickbase determines that's too much to process and give you back in one load, it's going to give you back. It's going to give you back less than that. So you need to do skip. I think you need to do skip, and when you do skip, number of records is less than total records. I think I'm answering your question. I'm not 100% sure though. Let's see, are there other questions in there, Bree, that you see?
No, it looks like we have got them all. I put out a last call. Get your questions in now. And I was going to say on that 10 meg limit, I would point out that most APIs have their own limit. So we're just talking about like the Quickbase ones right now, but like if you were doing something with, say, Salesforce or something like that, they're going to have their own payload limit. So be sure to check that documentation.
Yep. Cool. All right. Well, if there's no other questions, hope everyone had a good Empower. Hopefully next year it'll be in person and get the see people in person. I like doing the in-person ones much better. So thank you, everyone. And also, yeah, go ahead and please please make sure you guys go out and rate the sessions. Give us feedback. It's definitely helpful. All right. Thank you very much, everyone.